All right, cool. So my name is Varun. I'm part of the developer experience team here at Chromatic, and I'm very excited about talking about generative UI today. It is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So with us today, we have Michael Magan, who is co-creator of Tambo, which is a React SDK for building generative UIs. Welcome, Michael. Do you want to give a quick intro to yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael. As Varun mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Tambo, and we're building a generative UI SDK and agent. So you plop it into your React app, register your React components, and the agent can speak your UI. But yeah, just a little bit about me. I worked in product in tech for the last 10 years. So I worked at some big companies that did from job search to crypto taxes. So a variety of different tasks, sometimes sometimes more engineering facing, sometimes more end user facing. But yeah, so this problem, I think the problem that generative UI solves is very near and dear to my heart as somebody who's been building products for the last 10 years. We can get more into that later, I think, when we talk about generative UI and what are some of the benefits.
Nice. Thanks, Michael. So I'd say like seeing LLMs generate code is still pretty magical, but when it comes to like the combination of front-end and AI, the generative UI space is very, very interesting. So let's just start from the top. What is generative UI?
Yeah, so I like to broadly define it as any time that an LLM, AI agent, whatever you want to call it, defines what should be shown to the user, right? And so it's like a very broad definition. Now, I think when people think of generative UI, they might have, one aspect of that that comes to mind, but I would actually include chat UIs as being generative interfaces, right? Even though it's just generating markdown, I consider Wikipedia to be an interface of a sort,
Mhm.
and that is also an interface. But I think what's getting people really excited today is more of the visual interfaces where an agent is or an AI is showing visual interfaces to the user based on the context or what they're trying to accomplish. And so that's what we built, Tambo more for. But I do like to kind of start with that just general concept of any time that you have an agent or AI determining what the user sees and interacts with, I would consider that to be in the broad category of generative user interfaces.
That's right. So I know like Google's been showing off stuff now where uh, in within search, it's able to, based on your queries, generate like an app from scratch. But I think in that case, they're actually literally writing code for you. But your vision is slightly different to that, right? You don't believe that the LLM should be just writing code from scratch every single time.
Yeah, yeah. So I like to say that generative UI is on a spectrum, right, of how many degrees of freedom you give the AI to make something. And obviously writing code is, on the far end of degrees of freedom. But I think when I look at some of the best agent implementations today, they don't actually expect the agent to write code for like every situation. It you give it a good set of tools, and those tools really speed up both the experience of working with the agent and the quality of the output of the agent. I mean, a lot of what skills are today are basically packaged up tasks that an agent could use, or tools that an agent could use to perform a task better than just writing everything from scratch from the get-go. And so I think we're going to see the same patterns in generative user interfaces where we still have you know teams of people thinking about what are the interfaces that should exist in this application, how should they look and feel, how do people interact with them. And the agent will just be really good at picking the right interfaces and recombining the interfaces to meet the individual needs of each user. So that is kind of my take, is that we will see a similar thing that's happening with, let's say coding agents to
Mhm.
generative user interface agents, where you'll see people building out, libraries of components for the agent for that particular domain that agent is working in.
Right. So these are the same components that you're using to build apps right now. The only difference is, like currently, a developer has to go and compose them into a page, but you foresee where there might be a mix where there might be some interface that is pre-designed, but others are dynamically composed on the fly.
Yeah, you make a really good point that if you think about it today, this is how components work today, right? You create a component, then you register that component on a page, and then a user will see that component based on some sort of arbitrary navigation scheme you have to render that page or to pull that into another page. And a lot of what Tambo is really just trying to do is say, hey, what if we add another layer on that, at least for now, and maybe it eventually replaces it, where the deciding what to render on the page is dictated by the agent. And so the user could say something like, hey, I need to, upload my latest file for X and get reimbursed or something like that. Instead of having to find out how to navigate through the page to find that or search for the page and then it like pulls the page up or something, I just start typing it and it just starts pulling up the right UI. Maybe it starts pre-filling drop downs based on the context I just gave it. And so it's more just thinking of like, how do you pass context to the component? Historically, you had to, where it lived in the app is the way you passed context to it. And now the agent is just passing that context based on the conversation or what it knows about the user.
Okay, that's fascinating. Um, I feel like this might be one of those things where let's just see it in action, and it might just connect the dots for folks a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want me to start pulling up a demo real
Sure.
quick then? Okay, pulling this up. So this is a little kind of analytics template. So it's pretty lightweight because this is for developers who are starting to use Tambo, and we didn't want to put a lot of stuff into it, just enough to kind of get a sense of how Tambo would work. And so you could imagine, like, let's say I was building an analytics platform. Historically, I would have had to create, some sort of UI for adding graphs, some sort of UI for like adding them to a canvas and like moving stuff around on a canvas. Um, and actually, one thing I really want to point out before I start the demo is that we also aren't trying to say that we want to get rid of every visual interaction. We think there's a lot of benefit to visual interactions. We just want to add natural language as another like input method. We can talk more about that in a minute, but
Mhm.
so for demo purposes, I'll just say, hey, make up a graph, And so if I was using this as a real user, I might be saying something like, okay, so it's asking me some questions because it wants a little bit more context. Sales by region, let's say. If I was a real user, I might have something in mind like, hey, I want to see our sales broken down by, different categories or something like, or some category that
Mhm.
comes to mind as a salesperson or the chief revenue officer. So I just kind of generated this graph for me. I can say, hey, make it a line graph. So I might have historically had to go into some graph editing pane where I had to like figure out, where the drop down was to pick which line visualization I wanted to use. But then what's really cool is, I can still have the visual interactions that I would expect, be able to like drag and drop something onto a canvas. Maybe let's say I created a bunch of canvases. I might say something like, rename canvas. And so it could think like, hey, maybe these are all sales graphs. It should rename it. It's going to say, let's say sales graph. Okay. Well, it's not doing it right now, but right now,
Yeah.
like this is also supposed to be an interactable where the agent can like interact with that component. But that's kind of the idea is having the ability to kind of generate components. These are all just your React components registered with an agent. And then you get all of the same things you would build with React, the ability to, have interactiveness to the components, be able to like drag and drop or like whatever you could do in React, you can still have with an agent.
This is super cool. So I just want to break down. So there's like couple different things happening here. So one is, like you said, these are just React components in your application. I believe you're using a charting library called Rechart. So it's just like a standard charting library. There's a storybook for it. You can go find it and see what components are in there. And then as you are talking to the LLM here, it is deciding which specific chart type to use and pre-populating with the actual data that is within your application.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one thing you could see here real quick, I kind of glossed over it, but it made a request to a tool to get the data, and then it used that data to populate the graph. And actually for graphing, examples. We've seen a lot of people where they'll have a tool that returns, a resource, and then that resource gets passed to the graph because you don't want the LLM to have to, reproduce lots of data. But for demo purposes, it's
Right.
sufficient if the data is small enough.
Right. So that's one aspect is it's generating components, which the user can see in this chat interface here or drag and drop onto the canvas. And then the other bit you were talking about is actually editing the live UI. So through natural
Yeah.
language, you're able to edit the UI itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's actually just create a few more. Let's say create another pie graph. Let's say, for example. So, okay, it's going to ask me some questions. Let's say units sold. Okay, so we're just going to create a graph.
Mhm.
Say shorten the names of the graphs. Let's see if that works this time.
Okay.
All right, so it's asking me because it wants to confirm. But so in this case, like this element on this side is what we call like an interactable.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. I'll have to. I think I was making some changes to this template. We'll update in the future. But normally with an interactable, you can basically this chat will see
Right.
what components are available on the screen and what their states are, and then it's able to update the states of those components almost as if a user did it. And
Right.
so the whole idea is that the agent can act both like a user and can also kind of show information to the user.
Got it. Got it. So I have a few questions here that
Yeah.
might get us into the next stage of like how this is implemented. So the first question I have here from Devin is, do your libraries pair well with stuff like AGUI or Copilot Kit, or would you be competing with those?
Yeah, so actually we're working on a V1 of Tambo that under the hood is using AGUI events. And actually we have right now a way to replace the Tambo agent with another agent, and we are using AGUI under the hood. I think
Hmm.
it's a great protocol. It handles a lot of, basically like how do you communicate between the API and the client.
Right.
Um, so if you're using AGUI, you can definitely like check us out and we'll talk more about it. But one thing that we've been leaning into, which is a little bit different, is we at first, just to make it easier for people to integrate, we built an agent.
Hmm.
And what we've been basically leaning into is like, what if we basically just gave you the agent and you didn't have to go build the actual like agent that is using your interface? Because we kind of think that's like a general purpose agent that like will work in most contexts, and that what we think most people should focus on is like what is the interface, how do people interact with that agent is really valuable, and then like what
Hmm.
kind of tools or data does that agent have for that domain. So a lot of our users are actually using MCP and some other protocols to have sub agents that have maybe more specific tasks, but that the core kind of user experience agent is just using the Tambo agent. So that's actually something like some of our users have found to be a lot easier, not needing to
Right.
spin up another agentic framework and get that going. So it's like it's kind of a trade-off. It depends on kind of what you're trying to build and where your expertise lies. And our users tend to be more product engineers, people who've been building React components and interfaces. And so for them, Tambo kind of speeds them up and lets them focus on what they already know how to do really well.
That makes sense. So the chat on the left is actually something that Tambo itself gives you. So you don't have to worry about implementing that chat, how to make queries to the LLMs and how to get data formatted back for components. All of that stuff is handled by the Tambo framework itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And we do have ways to, replace our agent with your own agent. But
Hmm.
more and more we're finding people are just using the Tambo agent, and they find that it's easier to use and get set up with and focus on where they can differentiate from the agent.
Got it. So let's look at the code a little bit. So how exactly are you taking these React components and providing that to the LLM so that it can generate stuff on the fly?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just kind of dig in. You can see my screen, or are you still
Yes,
looking
I
at
can see
Chrome?
the browser. Yes.
Oh, okay. Let me switch then. right. Okay. So at a high level, what Tambo, the React package provides is a provider model. So we have the Tambo provider. This is where you would, pass in your API key for Tambo. You also pass in a list of components, tools, or like local MCP servers. But today we'll focus more on the components because that's the probably most interesting
Mhm.
aspect for this audience. So a tool. So basically, the components are put into what we call a registry. And so right here is what it looks like. It's basically just a JSON schema where you pass in like what's the name of the component, a short description. This is used by the agent to decide, when to show it, the actual component itself, and then a schema, which we support Zod, JSON schema, Valibot, a bunch of other schema libraries. Generally, I've been using Zod. I find that to be like the most easy to work with. A lot of people, a lot of our users are also using Zod. But under the hood, the components look really just like any other React component. So if you're familiar with React, this code will look very familiar. It's just a React component. The major differences are, this graph schema, which is passed to the model about, hey, what data needs to be passed, and what data can be passed by the model, and whether it should or not. And we actually use, the describe pretty heavily to help the agent know when to use these different schemas and how to use them. And then our package also provides, I'm not sure if this component has it, a series of hooks that you can use for handling streaming events. So, for example, if you're generating a form and values are streaming in, there's certain types of elements that you might want to wait until the value is complete, or you maybe want to give it some sort of treatment to make it clear that this is still generating, it's incomplete. So we provide some hooks that handle that too. And then we also provide a bunch of other hooks that help the component know like where it's living inside of the message history, as well as we also provide some hooks for managing state. So for example,
Right.
if you want the user to like interact with the component and then you want the agent to be aware of that state. So a really good example might be like an email component where you want to see like what updates they made to the email body, for example, and then you want to know if it's been sent. So for example, if I hit send or forget to hit send and then I type something later and it says, oh, you never sent the email, you're like, oh yeah, I need to send that email before my next task or something like that. So
Right.
yeah, basically, but under the hood, like if you're a React developer, like all of this should feel very familiar, the provider model, the use effect. And then we also provide a set of components to get you started. But under the
Mhm.
hood, it's just a React SDK.
And this is more of a foundational question. Currently, Tambo only works with React components, right?
Yeah, currently we only support React. We're working on an updated version of the React, or sorry, of the SDK that pulls out some of the logic from the React SDK so we can support a few other frameworks. Um, we actually have had people use it in other frameworks. They just kind of go directly. We have a TypeScript SDK that just does the kind of interface between, uh, or basically directly to the API, and they've kind of like rebuilt some of the Tambo magic in React SDK. But
Mhm.
yeah, we're still working on support for those. If somebody's really interested, yeah, feel free to reach out to me and we could talk more about what framework you're interested in and what the timeline would be.
Right. So there's a couple questions here where I think even though like the point is like these are just React components, maybe there's like some confusion around like how these components differentiate from like are these like the same React components that you use for everything else, or are they formatted differently? So I was wondering, I was playing around with Tempo a little bit too. If I can show a little example on my end. Um, so this is if you've attended one of these sessions before, or if you're a Storybook user, you're probably familiar with Meal Drop, which is a demo application that we use quite a lot with Storybook. So these are the components used to build this. It's kind of like an Uber Eats type application. So if I look at the code, this restaurant card component is just a straight up React component. There's nothing fancy done here. It's just exactly the type of component you would use to build applications. But then what I've done is similar to what Michael was showing. I have created, so let's go to the restaurant card component specifically. generated the schema for this particular component. So essentially, all the types in its interface were parsed into generating the schema, and then registered that with Tambo, adding it to this Tambo component array, and then passing that into the Tambo provider with the list of all my components. Um, in fact, like instead of like manually generating the schema, what I did was I used Claude Code and asked it to use Storybook MCP server to and just basically gave it a list of components in my application and said, hey, go use the Storybook docs tool and generate the Zod schema for me. And it was able to do that in one shot, including pulling in descriptions and stuff, because again, like through stories, it had a lot of that context. So that made the setup process really straightforward. And then this is now Tambo. This is the regular application. I can go around, add stuff to the cart, order stuff, play with the application. But by integrating Tambo here, I get this little chat interface here. So kind of what Michael was showing earlier. So if I do something like, what categories are available, it is going to get a bunch of data from the backend for this application. And I think we should talk about that shortly too, how that is happening.
Yep.
Um, and then rendering all of these categories right here in the chat. So this is using actual category component from the application. So if I wanted to see like what Indian restaurants are available, I can click on this and it just takes me to that page or another category and so on. Or if I do something like, where can I get the best burger in town? Again, it's going to get real data and try to give me an answer. And if in that answer it makes sense to use a bit of the actual application UI, it's going to do that. So for example, it pulled up the restaurant card to give me that information. So yeah, like at the end of the day, this is just using the same components that I'm using to build the application. Like this card is exactly the same as this one here. The only difference is it's kind of being displayed in the context of a natural language interface. And this little chat window is the thing that Tambo is managing for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, it's amazing how many people who are using Tambo will tell me something along the lines of it was like a one-line code change to add Tambo into to add a component from our app into Tambo. And actually, I was telling Varun before this call that we've been talking to some of our early customers, and a lot of people have said it's like you gave the agent your storybook, because storybook is such a clear like way of thinking about, what should the UI components look like, and what's the visual language of your app. And that's like one of the most exciting things about these kind of generative user interfaces, and especially the way that we're building it, where you're kind of pulling in your own components, is having a lot more control over what it will look like, and be able to maintain the kind of connection between what your app, what the design and the aesthetic and the flows you build into your app into the agents that you build. So yeah, it's super cool. And I was super, when you asked me to come on, I was super excited to do this. I think Storybook is definitely like in a very similar space, trying to solve a very similar problem set of how do you make interfaces that are great.
Totally, totally. So I'm also wondering, so we talked about the UI aspect of it. Could you touch on the fact that these components are able to query real data, or the charts you were showing, they were fetching actual data. How is that enabled?
Yeah, so we do have a concept of tools, or we call them local tools. So the way that we typically use them in the past is like in your application, you probably have a bunch of fetches to APIs to get data. So if you go to a certain route, for example, you fetch all the profile data to display it. So what we use was just like, hey, let's just basically wrap those existing fetches to provide context to the agent. So instead of the user having to navigate to a page to make that web fetch happen, the agent can just make those calls and say, hey, I want to get this person's profile information, or I want to get, this data. So the tools just basically return JSON data, and then the agent decides like, hey, what should I use next? So, hey, I have all these components. Is there a good component or a set of components that I could use to render out that data? But we also, one pattern we're seeing too is people sometimes using the component to do its own fetching, right? So like when it pulls in that component might have a wrapper that does some fetching. And so that can be really nice because you can have, a faster experience. Like I think when in your example, it could be slow sometimes because it was,
Hmm.
generating all of that data. But one way to speed it up is to have the component have some sort of wrapper component that basically does the fetch, provides the context, and the LLM is just saying, hey, what API route should I call or whatever to get the data.
Right.
So it's kind of what's cool about Tambo is it's like totally up to you as the developer, what you're doing on the client, that you have all the same controls you would building any other application.
Right. Right. That totally makes sense. So can you dig into that fetching aspect a little bit more? So within the component would be like you can use hooks or whatever, but outside of that, the tools there are they similar to when you're building an LLM app, you might have tool calls that your agent can make. Is it essentially just the same as that?
Yeah. It looks almost identical to the MCP protocol for tool calling or OpenAI. They've all kind of coalesced in the same model. So actually, you know what? I could pull up a tool definition example, and then we could show that. That might be helpful.
Sure.
Let me share my screen again. Yeah, so it looks just like this. So it looks very similar to registering a component. The
Hmm.
main difference is that you have a tool and a tool schema. So the schema has what are the values that can be passed to that tool. Actually, in our 1.0, we're actually replacing tool schema with input and output schema, which is more similar to MCP and OpenAI. But you could think of tool schema as being very similar. It's
Right.
basically this is the args of your function. Um, but at a high level, what gets called is this function, right? And so this just looks like any arbitrary JavaScript function that returns a promise, right? So in this
Right. Right.
case, this is just local data that's being
It could be an
passed,
API call or whatever.
but it could be an API call. It could be, so what we see people doing is they already have, let's say, TRPC integrated. And so this is just making a TRPC call, for example, to fetch the data for their agent. So
Right. Right.
yeah.
Okay.
And then one other thing worth mentioning about Tambo real quick is that we also support MCP servers and we support almost the entirety of the MCP protocol. So we also have developers who are taking their APIs, wrapping them in an MCP client, and then registering them, either locally on the client side and they're using kind of the client auth, or they just kind of add it to the back end of the agent and making requests like that. So that's another way people are kind of doing that tool calling and fetching data. But yeah, we provide a few different methods. It's kind of up to the development team and what they're trying to accomplish.
Right. So David here had a really good question. How do we provide guardrails so that the AI is staying consistent to the user experience that you're already offering? Is it based on the schema, just like what components are registered and what those components can render, or is there more to it?
Yeah, so I think that we do a lot of it happens, I think, more in just the design of your application. So one way we got this question a lot early on, like how do you keep the agent from performing dangerous actions or doing something that the user didn't expect? And so we would say it's well, at the end of the day, it's like you kind of decide, what actions the agent can take and what actions the agent can take without user approving them in some way. And so, in some cases we say like, hey, if you have a delete endpoint, I'd probably recommend don't add a delete endpoint to an agent because an agent can just call that, and there's really no great way to eliminate that. Um, I've seen some interest. I mean, I think the agents are getting a lot better at following their system instructions, and we do give you the ability to change the system instruction. But even there, there's no way to stop it from doing that. So one of the things that we recommend is like, hey, if something is dangerous, this is exactly what a UI component would be helpful for. Like, hey, wrap it in a UI component and have the user have to look at it and confirm before the action can take in. So maybe the agent can only queue up a dangerous action, but it still requires the user to review it. And you could also, if you're starting to have issues with that, you could also add in more UI to be like, hey, are you sure you want to perform this action? Like an agent generated this. We recommend you double check it. So
Right.
I think this is probably where like the product part of the engineering kind of comes in. And so we think of the agent as, you should the least privileges type of model of, hey, let's be careful what we give the agent because agents can do whatever they want. It's almost like giving somebody else outside of yourself access to your app. That's got a lot of potential danger in it.
Right. And what about like data fetching? So in the meal drop app that I showed, um, right now it's searching data that's available through the tools. But if I ask it to like go find a restaurant in a particular city that's not in the database, is that where the LLM just kind of takes over and tries to get that data through other sources, or is it still sort of limited to what's the domain of your application?
So it's like up to you as the developer to some extent, right? So if you want to give Tambo, like we've seen some people give it, a general purpose browser MCP, and then if you do that, then obviously that will allow it to look up anything on the internet and start
Hmm.
suggesting it. And I do think one thing I'm realizing from these more generative interfaces, these intent-driven interfaces, is that I think we're going to start seeing users expect the app to be able to do a lot more than it can do. And this is actually one of the things like I want to bring it up really quick because I think it's kind of interesting, is
Hmm.
that when we used to build applications, you would have somebody come into your app. Maybe you have one of those kind of screen recording apps and you're watching them use it and they click around a little bit and then they leave. But in these intent-driven interfaces where you have like a text input, a user will, I think more often than not, start coming in and telling you like, hey, I'm trying to do this. Like, hey, I want to find restaurants in Delhi, and you're like, hey, this app's only built for the US market, right? And I think that you're going to start expecting people are going to start expecting that to be able to do a lot more and have a lot more available to them. So, kind of a long answer to your question, but the one thing we've been thinking about is this idea of people are just going to expect all the apps to do a lot more and be a lot more flexible. And you could totally start enabling that with something like Tambo, where you're like, hey, once you've exhausted our kind of curated data set, you can also use the web. And maybe you add some caveat and say, hey, I searched the web, but this is just web data. It's no longer like our data or something like that. But yeah,
Right.
I'm not sure that's the best example of where you'd want to kind of go beyond what your product can do. But I'm seeing people use CRMs for like completely different purposes than they were invented for, using Claude Code or something. Like they're just using the CRM as like a database,
Right.
but the Claude Code is enabling them to use it in like a completely different way than what it was designed for.
That makes sense. So that would be kind of again like that's like at that point it's just like product development, right? Like do you want to set a system level prompt to limit what your LLM agent can do, or do you want to open it up? And depends on kind of what you're building at that point.
Yeah, and one thing that we're noticing is a lot of these the newer models are really good at constraining the agent to like what you give it access to. And I actually recently was talking to one of our engineers and saying, basically, tools as prompt. It's really good at being like, hey, I only have these tools available to me, so I'm going to try and use them. And if someone asks me to do something like outside of my set of tools, it'll generally respond, I don't have a tool for that, or I don't have a way to do that. I mean, we should probably get it to not say I don't have a tool for that because that's meaningless to the user. But it's
Hmm.
interesting how it's already doing a pretty good job of constraining itself to the kind of guardrails that you're giving it by, the prompt and the tools and like what it has available to itself.
Right, right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions here. I'll share my screen just so that it'll be easier to talk about them. So Naveen had a question about this chat here. So this currently is just a Tambo component that you're importing. It's I think React with Tailwind. That's what's used to build this. But if I wanted to, you were saying we could replace this with another library and still be able to use the Tambo provider to render the components in here.
Yeah, yeah. I had a few people like apologize to me. They're like, I'm not using your component library. And we were like, that's totally fine. I mean, that was just to make it easier to get set up. We're doing a lot to improve the component library and planning to have like a base primitive component library where it's unstyled and you can kind of bring your own styles to it. But yeah, like the real magic is in the React SDK, and everything else is like kind of up to the developer. And we just provided this as like a good, starter integration.
Right. And then David had a good question about sort of essentially it comes down to like how do you mix and match? Like in this, when I asked it for like what's the best burger in town, uh instead of showing me the UI here, could it just like take me to that restaurant? Or is this a better way to do it? Where you show the card and then it's up to the user to click it. That's I guess it comes down to like that philosophy of like how do you decide like which action to execute on its own and where you let the user decide.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is also comes back to like what we're so excited about Tambo and how we built it is that we're trying to pull in product engineers to actually really start to like think about and figure out that solution. I think historically, building agents has been mostly the purview of AI engineers and like back engineers. And like we kind of really think that to make these experiences feel a lot better, we want to pull in people who are very familiar with like what are the best practices for building apps. Because I don't think that changes with agents. I think that how you accomplish the task is going to look different, but the what works, like, hey, what actions should you take without notifying the user? What actions should you prompt them to take versus do on their behalf? I think those are all like really interesting questions. Like in your case, for example, like, hey, that clicking that like changes the web page below it. I think that's kind of like up to the product team. Like, hey, what do you want it to do? This is what's so cool about Tambo is like all of it under the hood is just JavaScript and React. And so you can change that and you can say, hey, like, can the agent decide to move screens or not? Yes or no. Um, Maybe you could even add a prompt that says, don't change screens unless it's explicitly asked you to to change a screen. Otherwise, let them click a button to change screens. I don't know. I'm not sure if that was exactly your question, but I think this is one of those areas where we're seeing people explore and find what the right solutions are. I think if something feels jarring to you, that's probably a bad experience, and we should figure out how to make it less like that. Is like a good rule of thumb here.
Right, right. That makes sense. David actually did have a follow-up comment here. It's not just about deciding how the user interacts with the Tambo component, but where the Tambo component is able to provide some functionality that is available on the page, especially since we're dealing with commerce. So yeah, like I think again, it's still like such a new space that I'm not sure what the right answer is. I feel like it's the kind of thing where we have to put this out in the world and see how things are, uh, how things play out. So I have a couple more questions there that I think are related. One is how do you ensure accessibility standards? And Richard asked and Callum asked like what kind of testing opportunities there are. Um, for me, that's where it like comes back to Storybook. So like the fact that this component has some interaction tests, we run accessibility checks on it. So everything that all the components that you're using, if those are tested and the patterns that you're registering with Tembo, if those are tested, then the stuff that Tembo is generating is the same as your application and that should be tested and following the same standards as your application. Is there something else that you're seeing when it comes to testing?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think there's two thoughts on testing. So actually, I was just on a call with somebody yesterday where they were saying that was like one of their biggest constraints with adding these generative interfaces is they have evals for their kind of backend background agents, but there's not a great way to evaluate these experiences in a UI yet. I mean, obviously, you could use something like so I mean, let's just say for starters, like you should use all the same best practices you do right now with like adding
Mhm.
unit tests to your components. Like those all still work just as before. But the kind of more integration style test of, hey, if the user says this, how do you know, like, does it return the right component? And does the agent pass the right props correctly so that it's rendered? I think that's still an area of exploration. Like we've explored a little bit using Playwright to do some of that, where the Playwright agent will, you know, send in the message, wait for the message to return, click buttons, check that everything kind of worked. But I still don't think there's like a great solution for that yet. And I think that's something that, we would love to develop at Tambo or work with people who are developing good solutions for these how do you evaluate an agent that is not just returning text responses, it's also returning interactive responses.
So it's something that we've been thinking about with Storybook too, with the Storybook MCP server, because the idea is with that context, it should be generating better quality UI for you. And evals is the thing that we've landed on too. So we have like a set of predefined evals, and we'll run that the same prompt with different agents to see is the quality of output similar or not. So like how long is it taking? How many tokens did it use? Is the outputted component passing all the tests you expect it to pass? Then yeah, that seems like a good answer right now. I suspect with Tambo it's kind of similar where you can send that and see whether it's returning the right component or not, and is the component rendering or not.
Yeah, I think where we're kind of landing right now in the interim is that, we can kind of test some of the input outputs and then hopefully rely on the product team that's building that they're testing the components that if like, hey, if these props are passed correctly, the component will render. But
Right.
yeah, I think it's a whole new era. And I think also what's interesting is like, this example is pretty simple where we're like just putting components in a chat. But I don't think we're too far away from, maybe the whole like interface is starting to change. And so that becomes a little bit harder where it's like you have these kind of interactions between components, right? Or maybe the agent is creating a set of components that work together. And so I think that would be a lot harder both to build, but also to test. And how do you like build components that can be dropped in into different contexts? I think that's like a new maybe skill that engineers will have to develop.
Right. So one more question here from Christos about like what is the Tambo API key used for? And like it's this stuff that you're seeing here in the chat. This is returning some kind of formatted data. And if something goes wrong here, I'd like to be able to debug it. So could you talk a little bit about sort of how that works and maybe get into the dashboard side of things?
Yeah, let me pull that up. Sorry, should have pulled that up before the. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, so yeah, so like let's talk about a high level. So we do provide our agent as a SaaS. So we have a hosted version of Tambo that you can work with, and a lot of developers are using that because it's just like fast and easy to get set up with. We also Tambo is 100% open source, so all of this can be self-hosted, and we have other customers at like larger enterprises who are self-hosting this dashboard and like kind of the API that interacts with your users. So you can kind of own this end to end. But yeah, so we built this, and one thing that we'd like to start building out more into kind of our agent is, hey, how do you like understand what's happening with these agents? So I think it's actually a different problem than most other agent observability platforms, where there's a lot of like, hey, it's mostly text, it's making tool calls, but at some point in the future, like I think the agent to user interface is going to have a slightly different problem of like how do you evaluate them and keep track of it. So we built out this observability platform, for example. You can kind of look through the chats. You can see, what the messages were. You can see, what tool calls were made. You can see this one didn't have any components. Let me see if I can find one that has a component registered. Um, oh, this also doesn't have any components. Weird. Let me see if I can find one. Yeah, and it also kind of shows errors. Actually, let
Mhm.
me pull up a different project and see if there's one. Okay, we can use this analytics one. Um, let's see, did this have components? Okay, this one had 4 components. Great. So you can kind of see like the UI component that was rendered, what the props were passed to it. But yeah, so basically the whole idea of this platform is giving you visibility into what's happening on the front end of your application and what your users are doing. And we have a bunch of
Right.
plans to make this a lot better and give you a lot more visibility.
Right. So lastly, I want to touch on something. So there is like a couple of projects that are popping up now in this space. Google has A2 UI, and Vercel just announced their JSON UI format. Do you see us like with A2 UI, it is you're essentially generating a custom schema for all of your components. With JSON UI, it just seems to me at least, like a better format where it's just a straightforward format that you can just use it to generate props and inputs and outputs to a component and render that as UI. Do you foresee the ecosystem sort of standardizing on one of those?
Yeah, great question. Sorry, I had to plug in my computer. I realized I forgot to do that before we
No
started.
worries.
Um, yeah, no, it's a good question. So, yeah, we think that a, a lot of these new kind of protocols and standards are really like interesting kind of new methods for building out these experiences. But I think the cool thing, so like I was looking at JSON render in particular. I also looked at A2UI. But JSON Render, they also take kind of a similar model of where you have the client define a registry of components, and then that gets passed as a JSON serialized object to the agent. The agent uses that JSON serialized object to tell, what components it wants to render. So there's a lot of overlap there in terms of just like how we approached it. But yeah, I think it's great. I think there's things that we could even maybe adopt from JSON Render. One of the things that I think we leaned into a little bit more was, letting the developer kind of decide, what actions can be taken. I think JSON Render embeds a bunch of, common actions that a component should be able to handle. But yeah, I mean, I honestly think I think a lot of these are just like we're all trying to figure out how to do this, and there's
Right.
just a lot of like learning. A2UI, I feel like is really interesting. I had another engineer, check out. Apparently, they implemented A2UI like a month ago, and then found Tambo, and they were like, "Yeah, this A2UI is like a little complicated to implement right now, but Tambo is a lot easier to get set up." But there's trade-offs on either end, right? Which way you go. So I do feel like A2UI was going a lot more after like, hey, you built an agent and you wanted to like generate UI versus I have a user experience and I want to like turn it into an agentic interface, which is more what we've focused on as a team.
That makes sense. And then I guess there's also like that third option with MCP UI where within like the Claude interface you're pulling in components and
Yeah.
that is again something where it's similar to the in-app chat that we were looking at today, but yeah, but it's in the context of the agents application as opposed to your own application. So you're sending data there.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Facebook apps where it's like you're kind of building an app like into another platform.
Right.
And yeah, it's a really interesting model. It's kind of leveraging iframe. So you're kind of iframing your application into this other kind of AI chat experience. And I think there's something like to that. I have this kind of theory that that's going to replace SEO. So it's like instead of building out a bunch of blog pages, you're going to have apps build out like little MCP apps that get plugged into the agents, and they prefer that over text because it's like more interesting or more useful to the user. So I definitely think there's something to that. I think especially as like a distribution model or a way to kind of pull users in. But even if you look at a lot of the MCP apps today, and this could just be a limitation of the technology and like what's it's capable today, but you're seeing a lot of I would say like entry point experiences where you can use it to generate like a Figma mockup. But then if you want to edit the Figma mockup in any meaningful way, you have to like click through to go to Figma. And I imagine a lot of apps are going to be using it that way, at least in the near to midterm, as a way to kind of like pull people out of like they're using Claude Code,
Right.
and then it's like, oh, Figma has a good integration, so you can kind of go from like idea concepting to Figma, and that will beat other competition because the ideation phase is happening in Claude Code or something like or Claude, not Claude Code.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's really interesting. There's kind of this like debate going on, like will all interfaces just live in these AI chats, or will people have specialized applications? And for us, we've a lot of the companies we're working with are like specialized B2B SaaS apps where I don't really imagine them being accessed inside of Claude Code, at least anytime in the, or sorry, I keep saying Claude Code, but let's say Claude or
Mhm.
Open or ChatGPT. I don't see them necessarily building their entire app into that ecosystem anytime soon. But yeah, it's very interesting. It's a cool model. I think the people behind MCP apps and MCP UI are really interesting, and they've come up with a cool idea.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It kind of reminds me of like was it Web 2.0 when like APIs became a thing and everyone was trying to hit everyone else's APIs, and suddenly you were getting all this data that was, previously not available to you. And now it seems like
Yeah.
that's just shifted to the UI layer, where instead of like worrying about APIs, you're just pulling in actual UI from different applications into one centralized chat and interfacer, and then sort of using that as an entry back into that application and so on. So yeah, it seems like really like after like a long time, like seems like the web is getting into like an interesting UI space again, where we might see, like with responsive design, like we got to see like a bunch of different patterns, and now this is just blowing things up totally, where we're gonna end up with this weird mix of UI and natural language interface and like some combination of the two.
Yeah. Yeah. The example I like to give is that if you think about, interfaces to technology over time, in the like one example that comes to mind is like the invention of like the keyboard, right? The ability to like type text into a computer and then having a small screen, like that changed the entire interface of software. You now typed stuff in, right? Then you had the invention of the mouse, which then kind of gave you this visual input layer where you can use the mouse to click around on different parts of the app. And that changed interfaces, but it didn't like get rid of the keyboard. We didn't like throw the keyboard out and say mouses are all you should use. We're like, okay, use the mouse as like a navigational tool, sometimes an input tool, and then sometimes use the keyboard to input data. Sometimes use the arrow keys still to do different tasks, right? So for example, like kind of like figured out where they blended. And I think
Mhm.
that like natural language comment is the same for me. Like natural language is now this another input method or another way to interface with software. And I don't think we're going to throw out the keyboard or throw out the mouse as ways to interface, but it will kind of change how you use the mouse, when you use the mouse, when you use the keyboard. Um, so yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I agree. It's an exciting time to be building user interfaces.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I know we have like 5 minutes left. If there's any last questions, I think I see one here around will the favoring of building or composing with UI instead of directly with code result in a lot of spaghetti code, or will it matter?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I would argue it's going to I think like there's like two parts to this question when I think about my answer to it. So one is I mentioned it earlier and I'll kind of repeat it here, but I do think that how you think about a component is going to change. Like in the past, you had a lot of control over like where the component would get rendered. Like so you kind of knew what it was available to it and what context it was under. And I do think with these agents that are surfacing the components or creating their entire own pages for different tasks, you don't have that guarantee as much anymore. And so you'll have to build these apps as a little bit more self-contained or be able to handle, different being used in ways you didn't expect. Like, for example, one idea we say a lot is you might have components that you thought would be used in this context, but then a user will reuse them in another context. A messaging component is a great example where you might see people sending messages a lot more just randomly whenever they do a task, like, oh, I completed this, write a message to my manager telling him I finished it, or like, I just finished a bunch of tasks, write a summary message and send it in our Slack or whatever. So I think you might see that component being used in a lot of different contexts you didn't expect it to be. So that will be a challenge of how do you handle it. And then I think the spaghetti code problem of, I think you still have to write good components. Like the components have to be high quality. I do think that we might see a lot less, what I would call navigational code or code,
Hmm.
complicated menus that users have to click through. So I think it will reduce certain types of code and probably increase other types of code for handling, more contextual shifts.
Right, that makes sense. Like when we started building apps with components initially, you know, all the components were equal, and then we started doing presentational and container components, and then with hooks, we kind of like switched back to all the components are kind of same, and some can fetch code, some can fetch data, and others don't. I feel like there'll be another evolution like that, where a lot of the middle level of components might, like how many of those we write
Mm,
will scale up. So like the presentational components that can fetch data for themselves, but
yeah.
the amount of code we're writing for the page level and the lower level components might go down just because we don't have to worry about building all the different types of pages and letting the user sort of pull in information more contextually.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I think like the type of code changes, not so much like the quantity will go down. I mean, if anything, I think one thing I'm expecting is that there will be more code written in the future for two reasons. One, I think writing code, the cost of it's going down, just with coding agents. But also, I think, like I said earlier, in these kind of new interfaces, people are going to expect to be able to do more in your application. And you're going to not only expect that, but they're going to tell you and you're going to know what it is, like what are these different things they want to do. And so I think that we're going to see apps that kind of expand a little bit more, where it's like you used to stay contained to stay focused so that the app was easy to use. But if you don't have to worry as much about that because the interface will just show people what they need to see when they need to see it, you can start adding a lot more functionality to the app and handle more kind of edge cases that you wouldn't have handled in a prior software ecosystem.
Totally. I mean, this is a bit self-serving, but that just like goes back to our philosophy with Storybook, right? Like you are looking at components individually and what are all the edge cases for that component. So if you're building these more complex middle level components, being able to just like work on them individually within Storybook makes a lot of sense because you can see like if this thing just gets plopped into a chat interface, is this handling all the scenarios that you want it to, right? And you're building it in a way that it's less contextual, like it's not built to be on a specific page. Like, can this actually truly be used anywhere if it gets dropped in different contexts? So yeah, that's
Yeah, I,
this
I
is
think
this.
the quality of your like individual components going to have to go up a lot because you don't have that expectation. So I totally agree. I think was like Storybook or like how you test and how you think about all the different ways the component could be used is going to be like more valuable in the future than it was historically.
Totally. Well, Michael, this was fascinating. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for joining us. And thank you everyone else for joining too. We will
Yeah.
share a recording to this webinar, and I'll also share a link to the analytics demo and the mail drop demo that we shared here. Yeah, and look forward to seeing you in one of the future sessions. Thank you all.
Yeah. Nice to meet y'all. Bye.